Now, the story of the finest hours actually takes place in February of 1952. February 18th, 1952. Imagine the kind of storm that we had last February with all the technology we have today, which we could barely even get out of it. Imagine that actually happening in 1952. It did. It did in February. In fact, during this storm, it left 5 feet of snow from the tip of Augusta, Maine to the border of Connecticut. And during that time, thousands of motorists were stranded on roadways for days before being dug out. There was no power along the eastern seaboard. It was a very devastating winter storm. It was a winter storm for a generation. And during that winter storm, 2 oil tankers, 500 feet long, are making their way from New Orleans, Louisiana to Portland, Maine, because they're delivering home heating oil for the winter months. They get caught in this storm off the coast of Cape Cod. In fact, 5 miles and 25 miles off the coast of Chatham are where these 2 oil tankers found themselves in the early morning hours of February 18th. And at almost the approximately same time, these oil tankers split in half. Break like a breadstick. Huge explosion rocks these 2 oil tankers. 84 men are now trapped on these sections of these vessels, trapped at sea. And for the U.S. Coast Guard at the time, it was an unprecedented challenge because they didn't just have to launch 2 rescue attempts. They had to launch 4 because men were trapped on the bow and stern sections of these vessels that were spreading and separating at a rapid rate of speed. Now, from the fist of Provincetown to the elbow of Chatham, that area is called the graveyard of the North Atlantic, for good reason. 3,000 ships have gone down in that general area over the centuries. Now here were 2 more. And at the heart of the story of the finest hours, this is one of the oil tankers right here, called the SS Pendleton. At the heart of the finest hours is the story of this man, Bernie Weber. Now, Bernie Weber was the chief boatswain's mate at the Chatham Lifeboat Station in February of 1952. Now, Bernie Weber had a great backstory. For a journalist, you're always looking, and a writer, you're always looking for that story arc, right? Well, Bernie actually was born and grew up in Milton, Massachusetts. He was the son of a Baptist minister who had groomed Bernie to follow in his footsteps in the church. But, Bernie had heard hundreds, thousands of his father's sermons. So by the time Bernie was 15 years old, you can guess what he wanted to do. He wanted to get the hell away from Dad and the church as far away as he could, and he did. At that time, he could join the Merchant Marine with his parents' okay. And his father reluctantly gave him his okay, and Bernie went to sea, later joined the Coast Guard. Now, when I started to research this story, I reached out to Bernie. Bernie was retired and living in Melbourne, Florida. And I called him. I said, Bernie, I'm researching this incredible story that you're right in the middle of. And I would be honored if you would allow me and my co-author to tell this story. And Bernie said, Casey, or he didn't even call me Casey, he said, kid, there's no story here. I don't want to deal with you. I don't want to hear about this again. Find another story to write and leave me alone. And, he hung up, and I thought, wow, why doesn't he want to share this with me? Is it that reluctant heroism? Is it that greatest generation mentality of I had a job to do and I did it, and I want to move on? And at first I thought that's what it was. Later it turned into something else. But what my journalism background allowed me to do was it gave me the persistence to continue to call Bernie every week for the next few months. Because as a journalist and as a writer, if you're writing about somebody, you're trying to gain their trust. And I'd call Bernie. Bernie would pick up, and he was very gracious because I never talked about the rescue to him. We talked about how shitty the Red Sox were doing or how well they were doing. We talked about the weather. We talked about it, Milton, Boston, the Cape, his beloved Cape Cod. Nothing about the rescue. And finally, Bernie, I called him one day, he goes, all right, I'm ready. And he was ready. So we sat Bernie down, and he told us this story. On February 18th, 1952, he gets a suicide mission. because those 4 sections of ships are spreading out at a rapid rate of speed. It's an unprecedented challenge, as I said, for the Coast Guard. It's a rapid response for every cutter, every lifeboat, etc., in the general vicinity. It was an all hands-on-deck situation. But at the heart of the finest hours is Bernie's mission. Bernie was ordered to choose 3 men. These are the 3 men he chose. That is Andy Fitzgerald, Richard Livesey, and Irvin Mask. Now, these men had never trained together as a unit in the United States Coast Guard before, but these were the only men left standing at the Coast Guard station that night, and Bernie reluctantly had to choose them, and they all went out to sea together. Now, Bernie had been at sea for over a decade. He'd been into some rough ocean. He'd seen bad storms. He'd lost men. And here was a storm that gave him an unprecedented challenge. And again, his commander at the Coast Guard station said, get a crew, go out and save as many men as you can. Now, the official motto for the U.S. Coast Guard is a Latin term called Semper Paratus, and that means always ready. There is an unofficial motto for the U.S. Coast Guard, which is you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. And that's what these men lived that night. When I sat Bernie down and he started to relive the story, he said, we took these 3 men and we went into that boat right there. Now that is a 36-foot lifeboat. That is the exact boat. It's called the CG 36-500. It is designed to only hold 12 men. These men were going out to save over 30 men. So this little tiny boat, those waves right there are about 5 feet high, 5-foot swells. Very scary. The wave heights that these men faced that night were up to 60 feet, 70 feet at times. Now, Bernie and his men had to take that little lifeboat and they had to get across what's called the Chatham Bar. Anybody familiar with that area understands it's not just a great hotel in Chatham with a great bar. It's actually a place of shifting sandbars, which is very difficult to navigate on a good day. On this day, it was virtually impossible. And because the waves are crashing over your vessel at all directions. While the second wave they see is the biggest wave that Bernie had ever seen in his life. And it picks that little lifeboat up, tosses it in the air like a toy, slams it down on the surface of the sea. Bernie and his men are momentarily airborne. Somehow, some way, they all land back on the vessel. And Bernie hits that wooden deck and he hits it hard. And he peels himself up off of that deck. And he says he realized 2 things at that time. One, his compass, really his only means of navigation at the time, was torn from its mount. He had radar. It didn't work very well on this boat. So he was virtually without a compass and without guidance as to where he was going. The second thing he realized was his windshield had smashed. And he noticed this because now all of the glass was embedded in his face. And you can imagine the wind and frozen sea spray picking at his open wounds. And he said, Casey, he said, at that very moment in my life, that's when I had my epiphany. He said, I couldn't do what my father did. I couldn't preach to a congregation, but I could save these men. Remember, he didn't have a compass. But he told his men, he said, boys, he said, we're going to hit something tonight. We're not stopping. We're not turning back. We're either going to hit the ship that we were destined to find, or we're going to reach England. But we are not stopping tonight. So hour after hour go by, and amazingly, that little lifeboat comes directly in contact with the stern section of the Pendleton. No compass, no radar. Bernie always told me, he said, Casey, I was a good skipper. I wasn't that good. Something else was at the helm of that little lifeboat that night. But at the time, he didn't think that. He sees that huge hulk of the stern section of the Pendleton bobbing up and down out of the sea, and it looks like a giant tombstone, completely lifeless. And Bernie's heart sinks. And he says, oh my God, this is a ghost ship. Nobody is alive. I've just jeopardized the lives of my 3 crew members for nothing. we're never going to make it back tonight. And finally, Andy Fitzgerald, one of his guys, says, Bernie, let's see if we can get around this hulk to see if there's any signs of life anywhere. Finally, they get around to the other side of the ship, and that's where they understood there was electricity, because they saw a string of lights along the top railing. Under that string of lights was this one little person. Well, one little person becomes two, two becomes four, four becomes six, until you have 30 men, more than 30 men, lining up along the railings of this huge tanker. And Bernie sees all those men, he can't believe it. And those men on the tanker, well, they can't believe it either. They've been waiting hours to be saved, and this is what's going to save them. This tiny little lifeboat. And they're stacking these men on board this little lifeboat like cords of wood, again and again and again. Now they're well beyond capacity. They've got more than 30 men aboard that little lifeboat. Now, traveling back at that night was even more perilous than traveling out, because that little lifeboat was so weighed down by human cargo. It was almost like traveling in a submarine, because the waves constantly crashed over that little boat. But out of nowhere, Bernie saw the radio beacon from Chatham Light, and that beacon was calling him home. And after a couple of hours, that little lifeboat made it back to the Chatham Fish Pier. This is actually it right here. Now, you only see 4 men. Why is that? All the survivors, all the stranded seamen, they crammed themselves into the survivor's cabin, which is in the bow of that little lifeboat. Now, you can imagine all these people wondering where were all these stranded sailors. So it was almost like a clown car. All of these men started to come up out of nowhere, and you heard this incredible explosion of applause and joy because these men were coming home. That's these seamen finally getting out and getting onto the dock in Chatham. Now, this here, to me, is my favorite photograph, because it tells so much in such a very simple picture. Everybody was gone from the boat. Everybody had been taken either to the hospital or back to the Coast Guard station, except for Bernie and one man. And Bernie sat or stood right at his wheelhouse for 20 minutes, and he just cried. This story was forgotten to history until myself and Mike Togus uncovered it back in 2007 to 2009. And I remember after we wrote the manuscript, I sent it to Bernie, who was, again, retired. And he read it within 24 hours, and he called me back. And he was crying. He said, "I was wrong, Casey. There is a story here." I said, "I know, Bernie. You're that story."